Okay, the topic of this presentation is failed state and post-conflict reconstructions, part of the U.S. foreign policy class. So what we're going to start talking about is several important issues. Why are failed states important? What constitutes a failed state? And why is it a major issue? Why is it a major aspect of U.S. foreign policy and foreign policy making? So the presentation is structured basically around three central issues. What constitutes a failed state? What is the legal, the political definition of the idea of failed state? What are the implications of state failure, direct and indirect? What policy solutions are possible? And should the United States get involved? And if so, how, in what way, what policies could succeed, what policies could not succeed. And then finally, we're going to talk a little bit about a specific case, the case of piracy, which is directly related to the capture of one of the U.S. naval ships, Alabama, directly related to the issues of failed state and state failure in Somalia. So this is how the presentation is structured. So let's start with the first question. What is a failed state? Generally speaking, scholars in international politics, scholars of international conflict in particular, agree that the definition of a failed state consists of several components. First and foremost, a failure is linked to inability of institutions, law, and order. So what we're seeing is some sort of a collapse of institutional frameworks, domestic institutions, collapse of legal system, and collapse of social order, in other words. Now, the collapse of these three components, institutions, law, and order, is directly linked also with the contestation of authority and either the pressure or direct use of violence. Now, if there's a low level of violence, we're seeing a surge of violence. If there's already a high level of violence, so there's this pressure, the authority is being challenged. As a result of this challenge of authority, what we're seeing is a failure of institutions, law, and order. Last but not least, it's also failure of authority happens under circumstances that involve, in one way or another, surge of violence. And so, outcome-wise, in terms of outcomes, what we're seeing is, first of all, inability of states to perform their basic functions. And second, what we're seeing also is direct use of violence. And third, as a result of this direct use of violence, what happens is a ghastly presence of territories under the so-called no man's land, no rule of law, no legal order, exist and subsist on large parts of the world map. Appear, état sans gouvernement, as the French would call it, states without government. Instances of failed states, and when we talk about and mention the word instances, certainly there are ample evidences of failed states. Everybody will think and associate Somalia, first and foremost, as a showcase example of a failed state, but not far from Somalia. Occasionally we're seeing Afghanistan and Pakistan, the AFPAC strategy, so to say, again, indications of state failure, state slipping away from effectiveness. Of course, Syria, thinking about it today, reminds us in the process of the civil war throughout the contestation of authority as a failed state. Hopefully, Egypt will never reach that stage, but we're seeing occasionally here and there again an indication of a failed state. So here again, remember, the key variable is not whether the state is democratic or non-democratic. It's not whether the state uses excessive use of force to exercise its authority, but it's whether the state is able to maintain its institutions, law and order properly functioning or not. And if it can't, then what we're seeing is a vacuum, a ghost territory without effective government and all the implications involved. So to determine, of course, state failure, we can use different approaches or different frameworks. First of all, of course, the historical and developmental aspect of state failure. And here we have to keep in mind very much that it is not about, again, regime type, and it is not about transfer of authority. What we're seeing, for example, in South Sudan, in Kosovo, contestation of the central authority, whether it was a Serb/Yugoslav authority or whether it was North Sudanese authority, Sudanese government. But that doesn't necessarily lead to a state failure. Secessionism, attempts to secede, decolonization, and therefore independence movements lead to a failure of an old, the removal of a state, but it doesn't necessarily lead to a failure. In fact, the new states oftentimes perform their functions better for reasons of nationalism. There is a strong desire and a strong push to build viable modern states among newly emerging countries. And therefore, in these cases, in fact, not only state failure does not occur, but actually state becomes a more viable, more effective, and more efficient to deliver public services. So again, that's different from historical and developmental perspective. So the removal of a illegitimate or unpopular government from authority and its replacement with another government, which usually is more legitimate and more popular among the public, does not constitute a state failure, even though it might look like it contains some features of state failure as well. So this is something that we need to be aware of it. The second component of state failure is the link between institutions, law and order, and the exercise of state institutions, law and order are directly linked and directly related to the notion of state as in Weberian understanding defined as an institution or an epitome of an institution that monopolizes the use of power. And therefore, when that monopoly in the use of power becomes removed, we're seeing a surge of violence, one. And second, what we're seeing is either privatization or criminalization of states' functions as a result of its failure, as a result of its inability to deliver capabilities, as a result of its inability to deliver institutions, law and order. Now, of course, political scientists have looked and tried to define how do we define what constitutes state failure? What are the criteria? So, Foreign Policy, the journal magazine, issued and published an index of state failure for 2012. So let's have a real quick look at it and discuss it a little bit. From the index, we can see that the approach that they take very much is as the state failure as an indicator based on a number of different components: democratic pressures, refugees, IDPs, group grievances, human flight, uneven development, economic decline, the legitimization of the state, public services, human rights, etc. So the highest one is Somalia at 114.98 showcase. Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, formerly known as Zaire. Number 2, Sudan. Number 3, Chad. Number 3, Zimbabwe. Number 5, so Afghanistan, and then Haiti, Yemen, Iraq, Central African Republic, Ivory Coast. In one way or another, this country is from Nigeria all the way up to the top, and you can see the link posted on the PowerPoint slides. They all constitute a high level of state failure, anticipate state failure. And if we scroll down, of course, we can realize and see easily that a lot of African countries. Mozambique, 59, is probably among the bottom of the least threatened by state failure states. And if you look on the global map, you can see that with green, these are countries and societies that face marginal or minimal probability of state failure. So again, most stable or stable. Then you get borderline states, which is most of newly emerging democracies, and then of course endangered and critical, and this is mostly Africa, parts and bits of the Middle East for 2012, unfortunately parts of Southeast Asia as well, and Somalia being critical in the top, in the center here, right in this part. So, of course, we can do it by country. So there's this chart, this graph gives us plenty of ample information and data to define state and state failure. But the whole process, of course, has major political and economic ramification. Political ramifications, of course, are related with what happens. So first of all, it's legal ramification. What happens? Who exercises authority? If you're a Somali citizen, who's going to issue your passport if there's no legitimate government? And then, of course, last but not least, if nobody performs state's basic public services because of an absence of authority, what's going to happen to those people, you know? And of course, the economic ramification is clear. Its economy is failing and going through crapper, as opposed to political ramification, where economies are not necessarily falling, but it creates some sort of instability. First thing you're going to expect is that the state becomes a focal point of terrorist activities, terror networks, criminal activities and criminal networks, transport of crime. Third, it produces a large number of migrants and refugees. And last but not least, what we've seen in the case of Somalia is, as a result of this criminal activities, overall insecurity in the maritime routes, trading routes, and a number of instances of piracy, what became known as modern piracy. So the ramifications are multiple, and the threats are basically related to everybody. In a world of globalization, when international commerce is being disrupted, when huge waves of refugees from certain parts of countries with state failure are flooding Europe and United States, just to point a few examples, most of the cab drivers in Cincinnati and in most larger metro areas come from primarily countries as refugees from failed states. So there you go. St. Paul, Minneapolis, Minnesota has the largest Somali community in the United States. Again, most of them refugees from state failure. So these are just a few instances of how state security, U.S. national security, and foreign policies of multiple countries, mostly advanced countries, but also neighboring countries can be affected as a result of state failure. Bottom line, it's a bad thing. Nobody wants it. The question is how to deal with it. So, again, what are the sources of state failure? One source I mentioned was regimes of popularity, but it has to be distinguished very clearly that regimes of popularity might be either seen also in historical and developmental context, and when a new regime emerges that is more popular, that solves quickly the issue of state failure. Again, remember, in the decolonization, at least in the early waves in Africa, the new regimes were very popular because of the withdrawal of colonial powers from their domain of influence and domain of control in parts of Africa, for example, or Asia, where colonization was prevalent. So this was first, and this was very well done. In the same way, if you look into a lot of countries, for example, in East Germany, or the German Democratic Republic before 1989, the regime was extremely popular. Citizens were not loyal at all to the German democratic government. Regime collapsed. German unification happened. The new regime became very popular. Therefore, the German government might not be particularly popular per se, but the regime, the exercise of power, the institutions are present. They function well in the eastern provinces of now Federal Republic of Germany. And if anything else, actually, the quality of governance through law, order, and the institutions is much better than before when the German Democratic Republic existed. So again, what we have to be aware of that regimes and popularity might lead to state failure. Assad in Syria, in Libya we have, of course, we had Gaddafi. Clear-cut examples: Idi Amin in Uganda in the 70s and early 80s. So these are clear-cut examples of terrible dictators that are unpopular, and because of the way that they exercise power, they basically eroded basic institutional state was weak and unable to deliver. Because of regimes of popularity, which is why democracy is a good thing. When a regime becomes unpopular, citizens can go out, cast a vote, and replace it. If not, that may lead to a revolution or some sort of a political change occurring through use of force is one possible way. If the new government that comes as a result of this revolution becomes, or a political change, use of force becomes popular, then that solves the problem of state failure. However, what we can see also is various factions and fractions inside these countries that continue to fight for a long period of time. And if that is the case, then regimes of popularity and use of force, violence may very well lead to state failure. Again, the sociological perspective, from sociological perspective, what happens is while in the domestic markets, we want to ensure as much competition as possible in the area or in the domain of power, use of power. We want to set up a hierarchized system in which the state is powerful enough to exercise power. Now, in democratic countries, the state does that by democratic means. In non-democratic countries, by authoritarian means. As long as the state is powerful and viable and able to exercise authority, what we're going to be seeing is an effective state or a state that is not facing the threat of failure. Alternatively, when the state becomes weakly present or removes from its presence and stops delivering effective institutions, law, and order, then we're seeing a state failure. It might be because of, as I said, political reasons. It might be also because of ethnic reasons. That's what we saw in the case of Bosnia with the breakup of Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. The state, the Bosnian state and the Yugoslav state ceased to exist. But it wasn't replaced by another viable state with viable institutions, as was the case of neighboring Slovenia and partly Croatia. What happened is that the state that replaced Bosnia was torn into three major factions that took arms and started fighting each other, as a result of which we saw direct upward state and the direct open state failure. Okay, so that's something we should be aware of. And the last component, as I said, is the result of failure of institutions. The monopoly in the use of force and violence shifts from state to non-state actors. Could be militias, could be factions, could be various ethnic or civil components, various ethnic factions that might participate in either ethnic or civil war, and we're going to talk about the difference in a few minutes. And the net effect, of course, of that process in and of itself is certainly extremely negative as a result of occurring state failure. As a result of state failure. Criminal gangs also become prevalent in organized crimes. So the next slide here discusses basically the distinction between the so-called intra versus inter-community or ethnic versus civil wars. When that kind of state failure happens, when state fails to deliver in terms of institutions, law, and order, and at the same time, together with its inability to deliver institutions, law, and order, when state submerges into a massive use of violence, that usually happens under two types of conflicts. They're both internal conflicts, but one of them is called usually an ethnic, the other one civil, or the other term is intra versus inter-community. So if the community remains coherent, but instead what we're seeing are multiple political groups within that community start fighting among themselves, then this usually is called a civil war. So intra-community or conflict is also a civil war. Examples, think about China, the communists versus nationalists in the 1950s fighting each other, late 1940s, early 1950s, by 1949, fighting each other. Classical example, the left versus the right. Greece, the same example, Truman Doctrine. Classical intra-community conflict with some components of minorities being involved, but primarily intra-political conflict, which led to civil war in Greece, basically. Civil wars happen in Syria, for example, today. Although there's also an ethnic component to a certain degree there, it's primarily political. It's supporters versus opponents of a certain political regime. The ethnic conflict, or predominantly ethnic conflict, is when you've got several different communities inside a sort of conflict, and they start fighting among themselves over who's got the power. Bosnia, classical example. Rwanda of the 1990s. Somalia, to a considerable degree, it's also the clan-based society. So the failure of the state to deliver is based on the North versus the South, and on various competing clans within the South and the North, as a result of which state failed. Bosnia, of course, as we said, with the breakup of Yugoslavia, the inability to create effective Bosnian state led to the emergence of an ethnic war in which the three major communities, the Serbs, the Bosnian Serbs, the Bosnian Croats, and the Bosnian Muslims, basically started fighting positionally one against the other. And so to understand that, what are the criteria to distinguish between ethnic and civil wars, we need to focus on 3 or 4 basic criteria. First of all, it's the features such as language, culture, clan, or religion. So if there's a distinction in the language, cultural distinctions, say Muslims versus Christians, or Sunnis versus Shiites, clans, and that particularly is true for Somalia, religion, as I said, and sometimes Tutsi and Hutu, clear distinction is the language. Although they look the same, they oftentimes belong and identify themselves to belong, in terms of belong to 2 different groups. In terms of culture and religion, you're going to see the same thing about Bosnian Serbs, Bosnian Muslims, and Bosnian Croats. So clearly distinctive features that groups identify themselves. When that is a prevalent variable, then it would include, or culture could be the Sunnis versus the Shiites. Then, of course, that means that it's an inter-community rather than an intra-community dispute. Oftentimes, of course, competing loyalties are a central component in that process, in terms of groups refusing to recognize centralized authority. What I mean here is that oftentimes in political process, certain groups, a minority group, may not be happy with the outcome of the election. If, for example, nationalists come to power in country A has a major minority inside. However, this minority might not feel happy about it. But if the minority doesn't feel threatened from nationalists coming to power, then that doesn't necessarily lead, and would not lead, to state failure. If the minority feels threatened and starts to mobilize politically and take arms and challenge the central authority, that could and has the potential to lead to a state failure. So again, competing loyalties, a key variable. The other 2 variables are intrastate security dilemma. An intrastate security dilemma is a situation similar to the traditional security dilemma used in IR, namely, how do you increase your own security without making everybody else insecure? Except that instead of applying that on a government-to-government relationship, what happens is that's applied inside societies. How do you make the Serbs or the Muslims feel safe without the Serbs or the Croats feeling threatened? How do you make the Tutsis in Rwanda safer without making the Hutus less safe or less secure, in society, societies like this? How do you make the Shiites better and safer without threatening the Sunnis? And that's the specifics of these types of conflicts and they often lead to state failure because the intra-state security dilemma is much tougher to solve and much more acute than interstate security dilemma because of the risks to defend population and the opportunities to gain in terms of territory, especially in areas where you have mixed population, cities that have Sunnis and Shiites, Tutsis and Hutus, Muslims and Serbs. How do you manage these cities without how do you manage two different communities without creating incentives for attrition? Namely, one of the communities conquering the city and kicking the other community out of the city. When you do that, of course, the security dilemma presents huge opportunities for gains to gain the city, take it over, kick the population out, and rule and control it. And of course, the risk how to defend the population, your own ethnic group or population in this ethnic conflict. And so the last bullet point wants to emphasize here is that what we're seeing is that these conflicts usually have a mixed record of termination. Some of them end by attrition. You have to fight the war, one of the parties has to defeat the other, and that's how conflict ends. On other occasions, what we're seeing is some sort of a negotiated settlement in which power sharing, split of power and authority is being exercised. So these are two very different dynamics, and we're going to discuss under what circumstances each of these conflicts in the next video, and under what circumstances each of these conflicts leads to either ethnic or a civil confrontation. And if you have an ethnic conflict, what do you do? What's the right thing to do? And if you have a civil conflict, civil war, what do you do? What's the right thing to do? And when and how should the United States and its allies and partners become involved in the international community as a whole in managing these types of conflicts?